Welcome back, and this week we'll be talking about some political revolutions that happened in the 1700s, and this week in particular we're going to focus on the American Revolution. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the roots of the American Revolution, and then just a little bit about the revolution itself. Alright, now what I'd like to do is talk about the roots of the 7-Year War. And what I have here on the slide is two wars. The second one is actually the real one. So the real 7-Year War dates from 1756 to 1763. There was a war before this, and both of these wars got to start in Prussia and Austria. And what was going on during this period is that Austria elected or had a new leader named Marie Theresa. And so she was leading Austria. She wasn't very popular for a couple of reasons. One, she was considered to be weak. The other reason is that she was a woman, and lots of people didn't want a woman leading their country. Now, Frederick II took Prussia, and what I've done in the next scene, you can see a map here. Frederick of Prussia decided to take an area of land called Silesia, and he decided that when Mary Theresa was put into power, this was a good time to do that. So what he did is he invaded. Now, this led to a war that spread into 3 continents. So it was fought in Europe with Austria, France, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and it was fought in North America. Sometimes it's called the French and Indian War in North America, and it was also fought in India. So it was fought in quite a few places. Anyway, the details of the war, not really that important. I've put some of the major countries that were fighting during this period, at least in part 1. So you've got Britain and Austria, and they were fighting against France and Prussia. Now, in the end of this first part, you've got Prussia keeping Silesia, or taking Silesia from Austria. Of course, Austria didn't like this, and there wasn't too much they could do about it. But in 1756, when the real 7-Year War started, Austria tried to take back Silesia from Prussia. So again, you've got Austria fighting against Prussia. The thing to really remember about this 7-Year War, because we're obviously talking about these wars of revolution, is that Britain was fighting against France in both of these particular wars. Now, at the end of the 7-Year War, you definitely have winners and you have losers. The losers here was Austria. One was Austria. They did not get Silesia back. The second one was France. Now, France was the loser because it lost its colonial holdings. So it lost its holdings in India, so Britain kicked them out, and it also lost its holdings in North America. So France lost Canada and its holdings along the Mississippi River, especially in the south by New Orleans. Now, the winners here, Prussia, obviously, because they kept Silesia. Britain was a winner too because they started controlling all of India, and they controlled now Canada. So this is the setup of the revolutions we're going to talk about, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Now, you're probably wondering what these have to do with each other. Well, France, after its loss in the 7-Year War, needed money. And if you remember mercantilism was based on having colonies. So France just lost its colonies in India and in Canada. It lost out all of that money. So it needed money, and it tried to raise taxes. And this led directly to the French Revolution. Same things happened with Britain. Even though Britain won the 7-Year War and got its colonial holdings solidified in India and in Canada, it was on the verge of bankruptcy because it had fought in 3 different areas. So what it tried to do was increase the taxes on the colonists in North America, and this led directly to the American Revolution. Here's a map showing Europe, and if you want to, you should stop the video and take a closer look at this map. You can point out Silesia, figure out where Austria is, where France is, and of course where England is, and where these battles are taking place. And this is a world map showing where the battles of the 7-Year War took place outside of Europe. So if you stop the video, you can see that the battles were happening in North America over the holdings that France had, especially in Canada. But this also went down into parts of the Americas. And you also have fighting in India. Let's talk a little bit about the colonies themselves. So I've given you here some numbers. In 1700, you've got a population of about 250,000 people. And if you look at the number of British versus the number of Americans, now what I mean by American here are people who are born in the colonies. You've got about 20 British to 1 American. 70 years later, you've got a massive jump in population. You've got about 2.5 million people. And look at the numbers here between the British and American. Now it's gone down to 3 British to 1 American. And this is showing you that there's lots more people being born in the colonies. And again, I'm considering these to be American people. One number you need to remember is that a good part of this population number are African Americans. So these are slaves who are brought over, and they make up about 1/5 of the population. And of course, everyone knows there are 13 colonies. What's really interesting about these colonies is that they were governed separately. So you've got the British controlling all of the colonies, but in general, each colony had its own government. As I put here, it's got its own governor and its own legislative assembly. And what I want to do next is just talk about the different types of colonies that were created. There were 3 ways that colonies were created during this particular period, and I've given you the names here. So you've got corporate colonies, you've got proprietary colonies, and you've got royal colonies. And each one was set up a little bit differently. Of course, they're all being run by the English government. So corporate colonies, these were really set up by companies. So when starting up a colony was pretty expensive to do. You needed money to do that. And what happened a lot of times is that people pooled their money together buying shares in a colony. And this is really what a corporate colony started off as being. And when the colony was set up, the property owners, or the people who bought the shares, were chosen as the council, the governor, and the assembly. You also have proprietary colonies. Now these were originally set up by letters that were sent out by the kings and queens to explorers. And then once they discovered a certain area, they were given the right to run the colony. And so these were run by the founder and the ancestors of the founders. And I've given you the names here of 3 of those colonies. The rest of them were royal colonies. And these were set up directly by the king, and the people who ran the colonies were appointed by the king. So corporate, proprietary, and royal. These colonies were very successful for England in terms of the natural resources, which of course is why you want a colony. So in general, you've got wheat, cattle, corn, tobacco becomes very popular, and rice. And then you have other colonies that are growing the similar things, but were much more productive in terms of tobacco, wheat, and corn, mainly in the southern colonies. I just mentioned that you've got England controlling all the colonies, but there wasn't really one governmental organization running all of the colonies. Each one was fairly independent, and this is important to remember because this is why the American Revolution was so successful. So these colonies each had their own government. So you had a governor, and you had an assembly, and this governorship of the colony could do certain things, and I put these up here on the slide. So they could tax, and with that money they could do what they wanted to. So usually they would make public works like bridges, roads, and so on. These colonial governors and the government would control internal trade, and they would also make their own laws. Now most of the laws that were coming over were still based on English law. England, of course, controlled everything. Now in general, England took a hands-off approach to the colonies, but it did control all external trade. And again, think about mercantilism, where you have to have colonies and you have to protect them with navy. And so when a colony is fairly rich, like the North American colonies were, Britain didn't want other countries coming in and taking trade or using trade. So England controlled all external trade, and of course it also controlled all foreign affairs with the colony. So what this means is the colony of Massachusetts could not have a foreign ambassador to France. It just didn't work like that. You also have, which I just talked about a bit, the colonies being fairly wealthy. So you've got colonies sending wheat to the West Indies where the British had holdings there. Then sugar was grown in the West Indies, and that was sent to England. Now what's really interesting here is that the colonists were not paid with hard cash, they were paid with credit slips. So what that means is if you're growing something in the colonies, you get paid with a slip that says this is good for $10 worth of goods at this particular market, which of course was run by the British merchants. So that's how the colonists were paid. Now I just mentioned that England in general had a hands-off policy. This is something called salutary neglect. So what that means is England would pass laws on the colonists, and sometimes the colonists would just ignore that. And then you've got England not doing anything about it. So a good example of this is the molasses law. So England put a tax on molasses, and the colonists chose to ignore it, and England didn't do anything about it. So all these things put together, the fact that you've got colonial governments that are fairly independent from Britain and salutary neglect, this gave the colonists a feeling of being independent from England. Even though they're English citizens, they felt fairly independent. So I just mentioned that the colonies were fairly independent. However, you have the war, the 7-Year War that we talked about. In North America, as I mentioned, it was called the French and Indian War. This was fairly expensive for Britain. And what Britain ended up doing is telling the colonists that they had to pay for their own protection. So you get a whole bunch of acts being passed by the British Parliament that taxed the colonists. And of course, they didn't like that. But let me just go through some of these. So the very first one was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And as I put here, this is the very last year of the 7-Year War. So Britain had spent quite a bit of effort trying to protect the colonists in the West. And they figured that if they stopped the colonists from moving westwards, then that would mean it would be cheaper for them to police this area. So the Royal Proclamation said that the colonists cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains, which of course didn't really prevent them from moving, but that was now considered law. The next year, you have a couple of acts being passed, which again are trying to tax the colonists. So one is the Currency Act. Colonists wanted to have their own money, and England didn't want that because the merchants wouldn't get the cash that they thought was owed them by the colonists. So that was the Currency Act. The Sugar Act. This is one of the first acts that you get where it's starting to tax actual goods. So anything made out of sugar could be taxed. And what's really interesting is that Britain said if a colonist breaks the law, you would not be tried in front of a jury of your peers. You would be tried in the naval courts without a jury. So of course the colonists didn't like that. One thing that made the colonists very mad was something called the Quartering Act. And what quartering is when a government tells its citizens that it must take care of the troops. So quartering means troops could come in, soldiers could come in, you'd have to feed them, you would have to give them whatever they need to be soldiers. And so this was passed in 1765. Probably one of the more famous acts that was passed was the Stamp Act. And this essentially taxed almost everything that was being sold in the colonies. And remember, Britain won the 7-Year War, but it was desperate for money, and this was one way to do that. Now, the colonists certainly fought back, and they cited 3 major things to prevent these laws from taking place. One was common law, and what I mean by that is English law was brought over to the colonies, and there were things that were just assumed that wouldn't assume that things couldn't happen. For example, English citizens had the right to petition their government if something was wrong. So the colonists brought up common law saying, we don't like what is happening here. The Enlightenment played a really big part in what was happening during this period, especially when you've got this category of rights called natural rights. And we'll see this coming up soon. The right to life, the right to freedom, and the right to the pursuit of property or have your own property. As you can see, later this will become happiness, but right now it's property. And then you've got English political tradition, which is that people had the right to be represented when they're taxed. Now, the colonists didn't have that right. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase, no taxation without representation. So that's what's happening here. So England is passing all of these acts to get money, and the colonists are starting to grumble about it and complain to the British government that they want these things stopped. And in many cases, the colonists got their way, sort of. So I was talking about the Stamp Act. This act was actually repealed, meaning it was no longer law, in 1766. Now, this isn't necessarily because the colonists were complaining, but what had happened is the colonists started talking about boycotting. And the British merchants got really nervous because if they're boycotted, they don't get the money. So British merchants went to Parliament and convinced the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, at the same time, you've got something called a Declaratory Act. And what this said is Parliament definitely has the right to tax colonists whether they like it or not. And I've given you a statement here by the British Chief Justice William Murphy about what he has to say in terms of the right that Parliament has to tax the colonists. And sure enough, the very next year, you've got the Townshend Acts being passed, 1767. This taxed all colonial imports. And obviously not very popular. You have lots of people fighting against this, lots of colonists. And one early one was Benjamin Franklin. And you might have heard this statement before: repeal the law, repeal the right, or renounce the right, and so on. Americans started to boycott again. And of course, this made the British merchants nervous, and many of the Townshend Acts were then repealed. And in many cases, the colonists, ultimately what this led to is the American Revolution. So July 4th, everyone knows the date, 1776, the Americans declared their independence. And I'll give you a bit of the Declaration of Independence here in the next scene. The Americans started fighting with the British, and the British sent over lots of soldiers. And I'm not going to talk about all the military things that happened. We're going to sort of bypass that, and I will give you a few tags in the video in case you want to learn more about the actual American Revolution. One thing that the Americans did is they looked for allies. And they turned to France, who was a bitter enemy of England for a very long time, and they turned to Spain. So France definitely got involved in this war in 1778. And if you remember, France was on the losing side of the 7-Year War, so they were happy to go to war with Britain over these colonies. Spain at first didn't want to get involved, and what it said is that it talked to Britain, and it said that it would stay out of the war if it returned Gibraltar, which is a fairly small island in between Spain and North Africa. And usually the people who control Gibraltar control the trade going into the entire Mediterranean. England said no. So Spain ended up joining this war. And what I've done here is given you a bit of the Declaration of Independence. And I hope that everyone has read this. And if you haven't, you really need to read it now. And I've only given you a bit here. What I'd like you to do is to stop the video and click on the tag, which will take you to the Declaration of Independence. And what I want you to think about as you're reading through that is the Enlightenment. So the Declaration is a perfect example of an Enlightenment document talking about rights and liberty and so on. And again, I'm not going to talk about all the battles that took place in this war. So in the end, as you know, England ended up losing this war. Now, France and Spain were still fighting, and they actually didn't want the war to end. So Spain wanted it to go on so that it could control Gibraltar, as I told you about a little earlier. And France wanted to control more of the Caribbean. So France didn't want the war to end when it did, but the Americans ended up signing a peace treaty with England anyway. And this is the very famous Treaty of Paris. And I will pop a tag up here so you can read the entire thing. It was signed on September 3rd, 1783, which of course made the United States its own country. Now, there were conditions on this peace treaty. So Britain got to keep Canada because it was worried that the Americans wanted that as well. So they ended up keeping that. Now, Britain had still a lot of monetary interest in the colonies, and Britain was able to protect its merchants to make sure that all the debts that the American colonists had built up and all debts that the new government had with England were going to be paid. And it also wanted to protect a group of people called the Loyalists. So these were colonists who remained loyal to England, so they wanted that. Now, of course, in return, the United States had to be recognized by Britain, and this included the geographical area up through the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So in the end, you've got an independent country coming out of the American Revolution. This is important to remember because what we'll be talking about next is the French Revolution. And again, it was started over taxes because France lost the 7-Year War, but their revolution turned out to be very different. They wanted a democratic government in France, and what they ended up getting is a dictator.